Okay, good morning, everybody. Today is the 14th of ER. Happy Pesach Sheni, for those that are not aware. It's a day of second chances, new opportunities, the 29th day of the Omer. And it's a pleasure to have everyone here today. I want to thank first Sam Koenig from the American Friends of Bar Ilan University for being such a wonderful partner. As many of you know, we had a couple of lectures last year, but this year we've had a series of virtual presentations for the most part, and really appreciate your partnership. I also want to acknowledge Marina Padelko, who is the co-chair of adult education. So thank you for your leadership, and mazel tov to you and Alex on your new granddaughter. Oh, and also to our president. This is like a very important gathering here. Toby Schaefer, and mazel tov to you on your Benot Mitzvah, and hello to Helene and Susan and Renee and Audrey and Gloria. We're all here. This is beautiful. And by the way, I just want you to know before I introduce Rivka that the recording is important because people sometimes can't make it this morning, but you're not only talking to us, but this will be sent down in our bulletin, and other people who have signed up for the program will be listening as well. So I want to thank Professor Rivka Tuval Mashiach. You can't get a better name than that, for being our guest today. You'll have to explain that, like where the name comes from, which is beautiful. Is a clinical psychologist and an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Bar Ilan University. Rivka is also the head of the Community Services Unit of Natal, the Israel Trauma Center for Victims of Terror and War. Her research fields include coping with trauma and stress, identity challenges and identity reconstruction, and coping with trauma and illness, narratives of gender, and the development of narrative theology and qualitative methodologies. I've also asked her, she'll touch a little bit upon Israel's support for those in the Ukraine, what they're going through as well. And again, appreciate your time. As I said, I'm actually going soon to spend a little time with my grandkids in the 5 towns, believe it or not. That's where they're going to be. Oh my gosh, there's a big fair going on in Cedarhurst today. So they invited me to join them. So I may be behind the screen, but Roy Kurtz is going to close up, but he'll join in about 20-30 minutes. So without further ado, Professor Mashiach is going to speak for about 30-35 minutes, and then she'll take some questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to share the screen. Let me know if you can see. Just a second.
Rabbi, you're gonna make me the host now, or will Rabbi Kurtz?
Yeah, I'll make you the host now, just so it's easy. Yep, we'll do it now.
So thank you for having me. I want to briefly talk to you about a few ideas. One is the idea of how our personal narratives or personal stories serve us when we construct our identities, and why I view the narrative, the self-narrative, as a central tool in coping with adversities and in coping with not only daily lives, but challenges to daily life. So one aim that I have in this short lecture is to speak about the idea of the personal narratives and its importance. The second one is to look at different levels at which we have narratives. We definitely have our own self-narrative, but we also have narratives at different levels. We have stories about our families, we have stories about our communities, we have collective stories about our nation, about our culture, about our society. And the main perspective that I want to take today is to look at how trauma or stressful events in general meet each of these levels and how we can work with them interrelatedly. So why narrative? We adopt the narrative approach because it became clear to social psychologists during the mid-20th century that we not only think through facts, but basically each one of us from a very early age on has the tendency to think through stories. We arrange the world through the stories that we hear and through the stories that we tell about ourselves, about why we became who we became, about why things happened to us. And basically, that's our main way to organize experience. So Jerome Bruner, a very famous psychologist, really claimed that if you go to a child, even at the age of 3 or 4, he can basically tell you the beginning of what would become his self-story of his life. It's very primitive at this age, and it definitely develops and continues to develop. But that's the basics of the way that we construct our identity, because we construct meanings to who we are, how we became who we are, what our dreams for the future are, through the stories that we tell ourselves and others about our lives and about what happens through our lives. So the second point that is mentioned here is that we do not only tell stories, but these stories construct meaning for us. Okay, for example, we can say, I became religious because this and that. I moved to Israel because this and that. So in that way, we relate separate events and we give meanings to separate events that were not necessarily related, but we relate them. And this is why we construct our identities and meanings through the relations that we make between events. I will not go in detail to the third claim here, that we shape our stories, but we are also shaped by them. But I would just say that we are free to choose our stories and we are free to choose what we want to tell about ourselves, but it's not an open-ended freedom. We can choose from what is available to us because we live in a certain family, we live in a certain gender, we live in a certain culture, we live at a certain time. So we do have some freedom to say what we want to say about ourselves, but this is contingent on the context in which we live. And this is a beautiful quote from Spence, who is a psychoanalyst, a narrative psychoanalyst, to say, part of my sense of self depends on my being able to go backward and forward in time and weave a story about who I am, how I got that way, and where I'm going. A story that is continuously nourishing and self-sustaining. Take that away from me, and I am significantly less. In the final analysis, living only for the moment, I'm not a person at all. If you think about people with a serious Alzheimer disease or dementia, this is what they lose. They lose the continuity of being able to move back and forth between their life chapters because they lose their memory. So memory is a central aspect of our narrative. Now, we don't have time for that, but maybe in the future, if we'll have time to do a real workshop, that's what I do with my students when we have a lot of time. I just invite them to think about their own life story. And I ask them, if you were asked to tell your story, your own personal life story, what would you tell about? What would be the things that you will be must to include? And what will you leave aside? What is definitely part of the core of your identity and your story? And what is redundant or not a high priority to include? And in what ways would it change 20 years from now? How it changed 20 years from who you were 20 years ago? Okay, so that's how we work practically with narratives, both in therapy or when we want to do narrative research. Now, if I take this theoretical perspective to the field of clinical psychology, so there is an approach which is called narrative therapy. And its basic assumption is that healthy individuals are capable of holding a coherent, dynamic, flexible, and as I said, meaningful narratives of themselves. But when something gets wrong, and we'll immediately go to it, So we start seeing flows in the narrative. It may be that the narrative become incoherent. We may have memory gaps. We may find stories that go nowhere. They don't have an endpoint. Or we may have events without relationships between them. All these deficits in the narrative are markers for ill well-being or psychopathology. So this is why psychotherapy focuses on changing the story. We help clients edit and we offer alternative stories, and together we help them to reauthor their lives. Now, let's go to the issue of trauma. I'll do it very briefly because of the sake of time, but think of yourself going through your lives, okay? Imagining your future, planning your experiences and your adventures with your children, your spouses, your grandchildren, and suddenly something happens. And trauma is such a sudden thing. We cannot predict it. We cannot prepare for it. It just happens without us being able to plan or prepare for it. And such is the case with wars, such is the case with illnesses, such is the case with losses, serious losses. And it turns out that such stressful events are rupturing or at least challenging our life stories. And let's see why. One of the explanations is that we all have like a library of experiences in our mind, okay? Our brain is like a huge, huge library in which we gather and we have on different shelves, different types of events, mostly the unique and special ones like weddings, graduation, special trips. And these experiences are arranged in a way that we can call them out, we can remind them, we can remember them when we want, and it's a voluntary recall. But what happens is that sometimes some of the events, like you can see in the right second on top, some events are not. This is why if we went through a traumatic event like a war, it is not digested as all other experiences. That we continue living our lives, but these events are just jumping out and interrupting and intruding our lives, and we cannot put them back to the place they belong in the mind library. They just take control over our memory system and over our narrative. And this is what post-traumatic stress is about. This is why it is accepted that trauma is a rupture of the narrative system, because it challenges the way we can organize the memory. It's very difficult to organize a traumatic memory. And what happens next is we cannot digest it and put it as part of our whole life story, okay? Not all of us are challenged in the same way, because some of us are more capable than others to be able to come to terms with difficult events. But the more traumatic the event is, the more difficult it is to incorporate it to the whole life story. So I'm skipping this one just for the sake of time, and I'll speak about the rupture of continuities. Part of the, one of the main characteristics of the narrative, as I said, is that it enables us to keep continuous sense of who we are. But when there is a trauma, so there are several types of continuities that are challenged. First, our cognitive continuity, because we cannot understand why bad things happen, why such a thing happened to us, what's the reason that we got hurt and somebody else didn't, or why we stayed alive and our best friend died. We have a huge issue with understanding what happened and why it happened. These are existential continuities and philosophical continuities. The interpersonal social continuity, you can see to the right, is that there is an interference with our ability to be in contact with the social fabric to which we belong, because it's very difficult to speak about what we went through because we don't have the words. As I said, if we don't have the memory, if it's an incoherent memory, we cannot share it. And if we cannot share it, we cannot get the support. Our role continuity is challenged, and also our historical continuity, which is the basic sense of coherence of our identity and image. Now, when we speak about other difficulties and responses, because the narrative is not the only thing that is challenged, we speak about responses that you're probably familiar with many of them. After difficult events happen, we can suffer from loneliness, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, guilt, and then we can move on to couple stress or threats to our self-image. The picture is very, very rich with, I don't want to call it pathological responses, but I would definitely call it responses that may challenge our well-being. And we will get back to it immediately. But it's also important to remember that there are positive responses as well, like resilience. Now, if we shortly look at different responses to trauma, so PTSD and all these symptoms that I spoke about, you can see them here, the acute responses and the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder. But sometimes years can pass before we show our responses, like soldiers who come back from the war and everything seems okay, and they get married and they study and they have children, and 15 years following the war, they start showing their responses. And their narrative changes then. But we also see that growth and positive changes can happen following traumatic events. And one very interesting aspect that I want to refer to in a few words is that resilience is also a very, very common response. And it's important to mention that it's even more common than the stress response. The majority of people, even people who are exposed to war, even people who are exposed to terror attacks, they respond with what we call resilience responses. So what is resilience? Resilience is the ability to bend but not break, bounce back, and perhaps even grow in the face of adverse life experiences. Okay, resilience means that we can adaptively and flexibly respond with accurate responses to what is needed. And therefore we adapt well. And it's very important because if you want it, it's difficult to talk in terms of percentages because different studies show a range. But in general, I would say that 80% of the people who are exposed to very difficult events like wars or terror attacks, they respond with resilient responses. 20% are the ones that we want to take good care of so they don't develop chronic situations of post-traumatic stress. But resilience is not a binary concept. It's not either you have it or you don't. First, it's a spectrum. And second, we can improve it when we do the right things and we as clinicians intervene. I'm looking at the time, and I will just say very briefly that one of our main challenges as clinicians is that traumas operate as domino effects because our resources that we channel in order to respond effectively to traumatic events are related to each other. So, for example, if I was in a car accident, and it's a personal event, okay? But what happens is that if I turn to my, let's say, to my spouse or to my community members, then I can assume that they will support me. But what happens to my ability to be working as before? What happens if I need financial support? Usually, if I'm limited for a period of time because I'm in the hospital, then the domino effect is that my financial status is really challenged as well. And also my partner is burned out because he needs or she needs to take care of me and the children. So we see that there is a domino effect even in personal events. Now, picture that the event is not a personal event, but it's an event that affects community, like an earthquake, for example. Who do I turn to for support if everybody else needs the same support? I cannot turn to my spouse because he needs the same support as me. I cannot turn to my rabbi or to the church because it was destroyed in the earthquake. So we know that the larger the event or the larger the impact of the event, so the more resources are damaged or need to be restored. So what is effective coping? Effective coping is asking ourselves, what can we do to add to our own personal and social resources? It's a cognitive and emotional process that we all go through. I don't have the time to get into detail. I will just briefly say that resilient people know how to do it. And what they do is that they channel all the resources, internal and external, and that balances back and offsets the stressors. And again, a very nice activity that you'll have the slides, you can do it for yourself at a later time, but you can do this exercise, which I really like, because in this exercise, what you do is you just name and identify your external and internal resources, which are available to you at all times. And then you just become familiar with them and learn how you use them at different times and prioritize which challenges, which resources are always available, what resources are contingent at different times of your life, etc., etc. Okay, I'm running because I promised to speak about the war and about what we do in order to help the Ukrainian people. If we'll have time, I'll go back to the coping. So now I'm jumping from what is considered a personal trauma to a family trauma, to a community trauma, and to what we consider a collective trauma, like the war in Ukraine. The family system may suffer or may cope with family trauma, like individuals can cope with traumas, because sometimes, for example, when a child is ill or when the whole family is affected, what we deal with is members of the family all need to cope with a traumatic event that affects them all. Okay, so that is one aspect of a larger or more broad level than the individual. Then we can speak about the social or cultural narrative, and that's a talk for itself, because you can imagine that if we think about, for example, the Holocaust, the diaspora and the destroy of the Mikdash, I forgot the word, of the temple. This is, for us as Jews, this is a cultural trauma, and we have many myths and many narratives at the cultural level about this. So when we move from the individual to the collective level, we ask questions of, exactly as we ask about individuals, we ask questions about, can a culture be traumatized? What does it mean that a community or a culture is traumatized? Where is it showing itself? What are the symptoms of a culture that is traumatized? Can we speak about a traumatized culture? And if so, how do we cope with the cultural trauma? Okay, I'll just give you a few examples of what we consider to be cultural or collective trauma. I'm sure there's no need to explain this picture. This is defined, 9/11 is definitely defined as cultural trauma. The trauma of the African American is also a cultural trauma that people of the African American community have shared responses and shared narratives about what it is for them and how they hope to cope with it. Trauma of the Ukrainian War is definitely, like other wars, one such collective trauma. So I'll come back to all these important slides if we have time or we have no more questions, but I just want to show you this wonderful statue created by Bruno Catalano, and it shows the way he imagines refugees and people who lost their homes and need to move and relocate to a new home. And part of the experience of people who are displaced because of war is that there is such a hole in their identity, in their sense of who they are. And I think this wonderful picture, as strong and powerful and maybe bothering as it is really showing that although they walk, although they continue living, there is something in their self-identity that they feel they left somewhere else. And part of their challenge is to learn to live with this sense of not being whole, or the sense of space, unwanted space that is created by this forced relocation. So collective trauma, this is one example, but it's also conveyed in literary and art, and of course, stories and songs are written that deliver this message. We as Jews have many, many songs that keep our tradition of all the history that we went through, which part of it is full of difficult events. So when we speak about working with traumatized communities, I want to speak about what we do, and this is a picture of us in the Israel Society for Traumatic Stress Research, which is part of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Research. Most of the people that you see smiling in this picture are from Bar-Ilan University. The woman in green is Professor Sarah Friedman, and I'm just behind her. And we both established the Israel Society for Traumatic Stress Research. And almost everybody else, not all, but almost everybody else are professors and faculty from Bar-Ilan University. And it's not part of the university, but we all do many, many interventions and many volunteering work to help communities in need. Hopefully in the future, we'll be able to build a trauma center at Bar-Ilan because we have some of the really best researchers and clinicians working on trauma. So our experience in Israel is based on working with traumatized families and children in the southern part of Israel, working with relocated communities. I personally work with the Gush Katif evacuated communities, working with military personnel and their spouses and families, working with terror survivors and affected communities. And therefore, we were able to develop models for interventions and preventions to build resilience, to supply effective immediate response, to mitigate the impact of stress, and to help in cases of bereavement and grief. And I tell you this because this is why immediately when the war between Russia and Ukraine, the invasion of the Russians, took place, we got calls to see how we can help and what we can do to help them because they were really, really surprised and helpless. And as I said, the clinicians there were part of the affected community. They couldn't sit aside and say, we'll intervene. They had to run away with their families and with their environment. So what we did is we initiated and delivered a few webinars to Ukrainian psychologists through the European Society for Traumatic Stress. I don't know if you can see the names, but we spoke about how are children affected, what kind of interventions can be available to deliver, even if you're in a shelter, even if you're at home. And if we have time, I'll briefly show you a short film that we created. This film was created in Natal, but we translated it to Ukrainian, which is not like Russian. I didn't know that before, but we found a translator, and it really, really helps them. So this is one thing that we do. We train their professional staff. We supply supervision of the professionals there on an ongoing basis, and we send them professional materials, which either we or they translate and can use. So this is, for example, one such film, which we created for Israeli children in the southern part of Israel. I'll show you it in English, and then if you want, I can show you how we translated it. But for this, I think I need to stop share.
I think the video might not work, but let's try.
Okay, I'll try.
And if not, we'll just move on. Just want to be proactive.
Okay. Tell me.
Yeah, it's not so good. I would just it's hard to see. The voice is not clear. I would
The
just
voice is not clear?
yeah, then yeah.
Okay.
We can send it afterwards when everybody
Yeah,
gets an
sure.
email from, yes, perfect.
Okay.
Why didn't you answer?
Okay. So I'll just wrap up and leave you some time for questions. So there are a few more examples. But my take-home message before we open up the floor for questions or comments is that each one of us has the capacity to narrate and construct his or her own life story. And when trauma occurs, it requires adapting the narrative and reconstruction of meanings. And trauma, as I very briefly noted, can be at the individual, familial, community, and collective levels. Therefore, we need to channel the personal and social resources, and that is necessary for recovery. I'll take questions, and if we have time or you want to go back to some of the slides, we can definitely do.
Rabbi Kurtz, you with us?
I am. It looks like Toby's raising her hand.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So you mentioned, working with different kinds of groups, but I didn't hear anything about Holocaust survivors. Has the group worked with them? Are they still working with them? I would think that a lot of models of resilience might have come from that.
Yes, definitely. Most of the work that we do is, as I described, with very acute survivors. because what we've learned from from our research and from the literature is that it is crucial to intervene at very early stages. Having said that, it doesn't mean that we don't do work with Holocaust survivors, but that work is a bit different. I didn't mention it, but the channel to work with Holocaust survivors or older survivors is through a testimony archive, where we sit and we help them narrate the stories, and we function as listeners and as the audience for them to validate their stories. As if you wanna think about Spielberg's archive, this is somewhat similar to what he did, but more therapeutic, because we have some guideline as to how to work with it. But most of the work that I presented now, which relates to the Ukrainian survivors, is because we've learned that post-traumatic stress is a disorder that develops. And if you intervene in the first month, you can prevent it from developing. This is why we focus on very hard work of intervention in the first weeks after someone was exposed.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Susan, looks like you're raising your hand. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I wondered if she could go over some of the individual coping mechanisms.
Sure. Of course. It'll be easier, I think, if I'll share with you the slides that relate to it. I ran because I wanted to speak about what we do with the Ukraine, but there is a very powerful model that we work with, which is called the basic pH. It's called basic pH just because of the first letters. And this model is based on the assumption or the understanding that each one of us has his own priority of approach to resources. Some of us rely on our belief system, whether it's a spiritual or religious or other system of beliefs. Others are more relying on their affect and emotional processing. Other people are highly not only dependent by utilizing their social networks in order to cope. So there are individual differences. Basically, I would say that each one of us has the capacity to use all, but we have a tendency to use some of them more than others. So what we do as clinicians, we help people channel these resources, and we just help them know that they're there, because people channel these resources without us, of course, but we help them see what is available for them. And sometimes we just remind them that they can use, whether there's imagination or cognitions, how to calm themselves, or we help them to calm themselves through their physiological responses, like meditation or relaxation exercises. So this is in a very natural model. I can show you a bit more detailed what each of these includes. I put it here because that's what we teach the Ukrainian professionals. And you don't have to have all, and you don't have to have all at all times. You can pick and choose, and that's what resilient people do. They know how to sometimes use their beliefs, sometimes use their affect, sometimes use their social networks. And if their social networks are not available, they go online and they get support from other networks. Exactly as the Ukrainian people, they understood that they cannot help themselves because they were all in the same shared reality as the people they needed to help to. So they reached out to us because the new Israelis have a lot of experience with trauma and with coping with trauma. And in that way, they channeled the social network aspect of the coping, and we were able to help them. Now they help themselves. We don't speak Ukrainian. We gave them the knowledge, we supervise them, and they do an excellent work themselves. Okay, so this is the basic model that we use. I would just add to that one of the resources which is not outlined here is our ability to search and find meaning in what happens. It relates to the belief system, but it's a more specific thing that we do. We try countlessly to understand why things happen, what they may lead to, what good may come of it. And this is the aspect of finding meaning. And so people who can find meaning in what happens, even if it's a bad thing, are much, much, much better equipped and suffer from less stress than those who think that things happen for nothing.
Anyone else who hasn't had a chance to ask a question, have any questions? Okay, well, I think you have to end at 10:50 anyway, so we'll give you 2 more minutes. All right, so thank you very much, Dr. Mashiach, for your time. It was fascinating learning about resilience, within our communities and also throughout the world. In Ukraine, God willing, we'll be hopefully living in a time in the future where this isn't as needed. But we thank you for all the work that you do and for sharing your research and studies with us. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for our partnership with Bar Ilan, and looking forward to learning again soon.
Thank you. And thank you for joining me on Sunday morning.